How does business relate to social impact? So, businesses oftentimes get a really negative rap, particularly in the area of social impact. Most people see businesses as being the polluters in the environment or being the heartless monsters that will fire people at will when they need to downsize at all to make sure that they have sufficient shareholder or stakeholder returns on investment. So, oftentimes businesses, once again, have this negative perception about them. But my question is, how do businesses have a social impact in a way that's positive? Well, we know businesses are employers. That is, they hire individuals. Half of individuals across the United States are employed by bigger business. And if that is the case, then they are dependent upon these organizations for their livelihood. So these larger organizations do support families and allow people to live and work and do the things that they want. And we know that larger businesses tend to be more efficient than smaller businesses when you have lots of smaller businesses doing the same thing. So the idea of an organization at its very nature is if you bring individuals together and allow them to uber specialize, that you can create more than you could individually. And while this is maybe not the case for every organization, when you look at manufacturing, say with one of the major automakers, certainly a smaller employer would not be able to do that without having this large or massive workforce or having the revenue to bring in the machines that can do that type of thing efficiently. You look at an Apple, for example, that has a lot of business lines and models, but they certainly wouldn't be able to carry this on as small individual businesses because, once again, the collaboration that is necessary to make that technological platform or ecosystem work just wouldn't be there. So there are a lot of societal benefits. But in terms of social impact, we know that businesses are ultimately not human beings that exist unto themselves. They have stakeholders, and those stakeholders are first and foremost the shareholders because the organization wouldn't exist without the money that they put into the organization for it to continue to operate. Because all of those projects that were started were funded not just by operational revenue, but from the capital that they received early on from these initial investments. And ultimately, the company would be oftentimes gutted if the organization were to simply buy back all its shares from these individuals. Now, there are some companies who reach the point that they could pay back all their shareholders with the amount of interest accumulated with the risk incurred in the scenario. Over time, they could buy back all their shares and exist for a single owner. And we see that with buyouts and things like that. But to the extent that the organization finds it beneficial to continue to exist as a public entity or an entity owned by a certain number of stakeholders, shareholders, then ultimately, first and foremost, their responsibility is to them. But many organizations do adopt the premise that they have a larger objective to all stakeholders out there, more of a societal or worldly view that if the organization exists, it exists by virtue of recognition by state governments and also federal governments in some perspectives. So if the government is facilitating the existence of these entities, then the only stakeholder is not just the shareholders or owners. The stakeholder has to be society at large because that's ultimately why the law recognizes these entities, not just to allow prosperity for those who own the business, but to benefit society at large. And what are some of those benefits of society at large? Well, often these benefits fit into the realm of what we call the social responsibility or social impact that the organization has. And that could be to account for the environmental pollutions that it puts out there, or to, in some way, to fight against the perpetuation of those pollutions. It could be to create social equality among workers because historical practices have obviously favored some at the expense of others. That is, women and minorities have historically been disadvantaged in the workplace, and organizations have some form of social obligation to rectify those injustices, or at least how they have perpetuated over time, such that to create a more diverse work environment that gives equal opportunity to those in the workplace. States want to incentivize employment specifically for the purpose of incentivizing consumption, that these individuals have resources now they can consume in the environment. And it's this consumption that allows most businesses to exist. So states have an incentive to, in a way, protect their employees. That is to make certain that these state-recognized entities are treating their employees fairly in terms of wages and compensation, such that the employer's not receiving the lion's share or all of the benefit at the expense or taking advantage of the employee. Because once again, the purpose of government is to represent the interests of the individual, and recognizing business entities to allow them to operate is just in furtherance of that. So you're going to have lots of employment laws as well, things that go to labor laws, employment laws, the taxation of the entity and withholding of taxes from the employee, requirements for workers' compensation, requirements for unemployment insurance. All of these things go to the underlying purposes of why state governments and federal governments exist, and what their purpose should be in allowing business entities themselves to exist. So the concept of social impact or social responsibility is, or should be, inextricably tied to the concept of the organization and why it exists in the community. Now, if you have opinions on what is the role of the organization with regard to social impact, social responsibility, please, we want to hear your opinion. Jump down in the forums, jump on the forums at thebusinessprofessor.com. But regardless, I hope to see you around the platform sometime soon. Until then, take care.